And then finally, wolves would be allowed to disperse throughout much of the state of Arizona south of Interstate 40. One of the key points in the discussions on the zone concept, when you look at the service's draft environmental impact statement, it points out that approximately 1% of Zone 3 is suitable wolf habitat. Our concern with that number and with that concept of allowing wolves to go into poor wolf habitat is that undoubtedly we anticipate a much greater impact both to the smaller, less productive elk herds that are there, and certainly wolves that would wander and in all likelihood increase depredations and conflict with humans. So that's just an example of some of the concerns that we have with that approach. To discuss where we're at with the cooperative alternative and compare that to the proposed rule, you can see that, again, as I've said, there's no cap on numbers in the proposed rule. The cooperative alternative numbered between 200 and 300. And if you look at that functionally, that's a number of 300. It's not, because there's no trigger of any action at 213 or 251. It's essentially a number of 300.
Mr. DeVos?
Yes, sir.
And that number, just for reiterating, that number is based on the total number of wolves ultimately we'd like to see in Mexico and in Arizona and New Mexico and its historic habitat. It's not a random number.
Yeah, clearly it's not a random number. We base that on elk densities and some of the experiences that have gained from the Rocky Mountains and looking at the productivity of the herds in Arizona. And Arizona elk herds are not all functionally equal. The more moist, higher elevation habitat, the elk herds there are more productive. As you move westward, you get into a drier, lower habitat, the elk herds are less productive. When we discussed the experiences in the Northern Rockies with some of the key staff at Idaho Fish and Game, their input to us was that the wolf impacts would be certainly lesser on those productive herds, and the impact on low productive herds is where they've seen their greatest degree of impact. So the number that we're using is a ratio-based number, again based on literature and based on the experiences in the Northern Rockies, and we established that at about 3 wolves per 1,000 elk. When we pulled the numbers out of the department's big game management summaries, there's approximately 45 to 50,000 elk east of Highway 87. You do the math, 3 times that, and it puts us at about 150 wolves in Arizona.
Thank you.
So one of the discussions that we've had with Fish and Wildlife Service and a possible resolution, and excuse me, it's clear, need to make clear that these are discussions, and the final rule, the final 10J rule will be published in December of 2014, and the full impact of what we're going to talk about today will not be known until that final rule is published. Both the discussions that we've had with the Fish and Wildlife Service identified the possibility of including a cap on the number of wolves that would occur in the southwest, Arizona and New Mexico, at 300 to 325, and that would be in both states. So it's not an individual state number. One of the differences between this and the cooperatives alternative, the cooperatives alternative said no more than 50% could occur in either state. As we discussed this with the service, we felt that based on equal or nearly equal habitat quality between the 2 states, we would not see one state that had a disproportionate number of wolves. In fact, today they're essentially equally divided between the 2 states naturally, and that's what we would anticipate to occur. So you can see the differences between the services proposal, which had no cap, the cooperatives alternative that functionally had a cap of 300, and the point of discussion where we're at now, which is between 300 and 325. So in this particular instance, we feel that we have fairly closely mimicked the broadly supported stakeholders alternative that was submitted to the service. As you pointed out, Mr. Chair, this number is consistent with the science underpinning of the relationship of wolf and elk that is sustainable, and I explained those numbers. But we believe there is adequate science to demonstrate that that's a reasonable number, and in fact, a larger number in Arizona and New Mexico would have adverse impact on the base population of wildlife. It's also important to point out here that the 10J is intended to contribute towards recovery. That's been both states' assertion since the beginning of the discussions that I've been involved with, is that clearly with 10% of the historical habitat in Arizona and New Mexico and 90% occurring in New Mexico, that the actions in Arizona and New Mexico have to be viewed as a contribution to recovery, but full recovery can only be achieved with a full involvement and support from both the State Wildlife Agency and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the non-governmental organizations for a broad-based program to achieve recovery in Mexico as well. Again, to reiterate the point, this number will contribute to recovery. There's nothing within the Endangered Species Act that forces full recovery within the United States. And again, given the importance of Mexico and the historical contribution of Mexico, it will be functionally impossible to recover the Mexican wolves in Arizona and New Mexico within historical range, which we think is a critical consideration for all that are involved. Definition of unacceptable impacts, as I said, there is no definition of unacceptable, and I think clearly as we think about many of the issues that occur in our daily lives, what's unacceptable to one is perhaps acceptable to another, and the inverse is true. So without a clearly defined definition, it will undoubtedly be subject to a decision by someone in one of the federal courts of what unacceptable means. That puts us in a position of knowing as we go into the recovery program or introduction program that this element will be one of the very first points of legal challenge. Cooperatives Alternative identified that 15% of the impacts would trigger wolf removal. The possible resolution that we're discussing with the service is a mirror of the 15% impact trigger to begin wolf removal. And when we talk about wolf removal, I think it's important to consider that there are some very beneficial reasons to remove wolves from the landscape. We spoke earlier about Mexico. Well, one of the problems that we've experienced in the United States and they have in Mexico is when you release a wolf from captivity, invariably or not invariably, but the probability of that wolf getting into trouble of one type or another, whether it's frequent contact with humans, whether it's depredation, naive wolves are just simply not as adept as wolves that had time on the landscape. So when we talk about removal clearly does not mean lethal removal, but if we have wolves that are on the ground, that are behaving well, that know how to harvest wildlife, isn't that the most logical place, the most logical animal to use for reintroduction into Mexico? Certainly we think so, and that is one of the key elements of removal, that those animals would make a contribution to recovery efforts in Mexico. And again, almost broken record-like, I keep saying that Mexico is the key, and it is. 90% of the habitat is there. The governmental and non-governmental organizations in Mexico are very supportive of wolf. In fact, it's one of their top national priority for their endangered species list. So we have a willing recipient, and we have a potential source for adult wolves that know how to live and behave on the landscape. The proposed rule has 3 zones for management. I spoke about them a little bit ago. Zone 1, initial releases and natural dispersal. That's the current Blue Range wolf recovery area and some additional portions of the Sitgreaves and Tonto National Forest. Zone 2 would allow for translocation and natural dispersal. You can read the area, but functionally that would run from the New Mexico border westward to Highway 93 and then include the area east of Interstate 17. That would encompass almost all of Arizona's elk habitat, including smaller herd areas with low productivity. Then going back to experiences from the past and discussing this issue with some of our counterparts in Idaho, again, those low productivity herds are the ones that have the greatest risk to being adversely impacted by the presence of wolves. Zone 3 is essentially the remainder of the state west of Zone 2. To place all of this in context, Interstate 40 is the northern boundary in all instances and all discussions. Cooperator's alternative proposed no wolf management or wolf presence west of Highway 87. Highway 87 originally, part of it is now I-19, that portion that runs from Nogales northward to Tucson, and then it follows I-10, and in Mesa it becomes Highway 87 and runs northward through Payson to the town of Winslow. What we're talking about as a possible resolution within the experimental population area is a phased approach. No translocations west of Highway 87. Again, I described that. No wolves can disperse to the area. Wolves can disperse to I-17 north of 260. And that 260 boundary was identified as an area. That's the General Crook Trail, or the road that runs from Camp Verde up on top of the rim and then hits Highway 87. The area south contains some elk, but at very low densities, and a much more suitable area with elk resides in the area that we've defined. This would be in place for a 5-year period, and then we would evaluate a number of criteria, and we'll identify those in a minute. But it is a 5-year place. If we have, at the end of that 5-year evaluation, failed to make progress on the wolf recovery program, then we would be this. You can think of this as a swinging gate. The gate would swing to wolf management or translocations to I-17 with wolves allowed to disperse to Highway 89. That would be an evaluation that we would make. The first evaluation would be at 5 years, the second would be 3 years after that, and the third would be 3 years after that. Phase 3, no translocations west of 89, but wolves can disperse throughout the currently proposed MOWIPA. Like I said, evaluations will occur at the end of the first 5 years, and then 3 years thereafter. Evaluations would include the level of adverse impact interactions between humans and wolves, impacts to ungulates, and whether the wolf population is achieving an annual growth rate of 10% per year based on the traditionally conducted end-of-year count. As it stands today, the potential inclusion of these 3 areas very closely mirror that of the cooperator's alternative. The cooperator's alternative is a document that was developed by both county government and stakeholder organizations. It was a hard-won agreement where there was compromise by a number of organizations and county governments. The importance of that agreement is this was one of the very first times in my experience, which spans more than a few years, that there was that broad base support for the Wolf program. When we started to develop the Cooperate Alternative, there were many organizations that were at the position of no wolves, no how, yet they came together to seek a common position with a balanced wolf program that allowed, more than allowed, it contributed to the successful reintroduction of the Mexican wolf, but did so in a fashion that was balanced to societal needs and land-based uses. The other thing is that, as I said when I started, the department will continue to develop our comments that we normally would in the absence of any meaningful discussion with the service. Those comments will preserve our legal standing and identify all of our concerns with the draft EIS and the draft 10J rule in the event that the Commission further directs the department at a future date to initiate any of the three actions that you directed us to prepare for, and that's litigation, congressional involvement, and possible withdrawal from the program. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I do have a recommendation, but we'll be happy to answer questions if there are some from the Commission.
Why don't we start with the questions? On the line, any commissioners have questions for Assistant Director DeVos?
This is Bob. I have no questions.
This is JW, no questions.
Yeah, this is Jim Ammons. I don't have any questions that have not already been answered.
Mr. Madden? Okay. With that, why don't we hear your recommendation, and we'll go to blue slips.
Mr. Chairman, the Department recommends that the Commission vote to provide the Department direction to continue to negotiate with the Fish and Wildlife Service for the development of an acceptable 10J rule for the Mexican wolf that will mirror to the maximum extent possible the Arizona Cooperate Alternative, with particular attention to the identifying numeric population goal, identifying identifiable metrics for impacts to ungulates, and focuses active wolf management activities in areas with robust elk populations.
Thank you. Why don't we go to blue slips before we entertain the recommendation. Mike Sorum, if you want to approach the microphone and please state your name for the record. And keep your comments, if possible, to about 3 minutes. Welcome, Mr. Sorum.
Good morning. My name is Mike Sorum. I'm in support of the wolf reintroduction program, and I feel that if we engage the Fish and Wildlife Service beyond just negotiating and cooperation, I think it's contrary to what this Game and Fish Department should do. I don't think we need to withdraw from anything. I think the science says that we need to do further. We need more populations north of the 40 and that kind of thing. Even looking at the mule deer population, they're increasing in the wolf area as well as the elk. There's plenty of them up there. I've been up there. I see elk all over the place where the wolves are. So I think the worst thing you can do is go the other way. I think negotiations are great, but cooperation and engaging the Fish and Wildlife Service would be the best thing. And as far as the recovery of the wolf, we need that, and all science indicates that we need more areas where wolves go, and the habitat is north of the 40, not in Mexico. And basically, for a long self-sustaining population on a reintroduction, I think we need a new rule or new reintroduction plan, and I don't think the environmental impact statement and such is really calling for numbers at this point. And I think the introduction plan is what we need to start looking for, a new one, and then looking at numbers there. That's where I think the 300 thing is maybe a little bit in advance of where we need to go at this point. I think we just need to decide on the alternative. And I think the alternative, for me, alternative 3 is the best because it's the one with the least anthropogenic effects, the human effects, but alternative one also gives the wolf more habitat to move through. So anyways, I would just encourage this department and commission to engage and cooperate with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I support wolf recovery for a long self-sustaining population. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sorum. Dale Voles. Please state your name for the record. Welcome, and about 3 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, my name is Dale Volz. I'm a resident of Gilbert, Arizona, and I've lived in Arizona for 41 years. I'm just a longtime supporter, avid supporter of wolf reintroduction, dating back to 1992. And I find it unfortunate that 2 decades later I'm still standing here defending wolf reintroduction and survival. Probably presumptuous in doing this, but I feel I must remind the Commission that you have a legal responsibility for all wildlife in Arizona. That includes non-game species, that includes endangered species, and it certainly includes the Mexican gray wolf. I think as a Christian, I further have to look at my biblically based Judeo-Christian upbringing I had, which tells me that you also have a moral responsibility to do so. Now, it's been a while. I have to admit it's been a while since I've read the Cooperatives Agreement, but it strikes me that its priorities are focused elsewhere, not strictly on wolf survival. And so I encourage you to work cooperatively with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, everything Mr. Sorum said, and pursue a reasonable plan to reestablish the wolf in Arizona. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Voles. Jim Unmock. Welcome, Jim. If you'd state your name for the record.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, my name is Jim Unmock. I'm the president of Arizona Sportsmen for Wildlife Conservation. I'm here representing 19 of our organizations that have supported the Cooperators Alternative. We believe the department has, in fact, engaged U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in a positive way for all of Arizona's wildlife, not just the wolf. And we continue to support your efforts and agree with the proposal on the board, and hope you pass it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Colazar. Good morning, Mr. Colazar. State your name for the record.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. My name is John Colazar. I'm president of the Arizona Deer Association. Based on what I saw this morning and in the brief conversations that I've had with our board members, while we have not had an opportunity to have a direct vote, because most of us were out hunting, there is a agreement to proceed in the direction that you have in this new direction of 325 as a maximum. Again, I encourage the department as well as the commission to remember that we are based on all species, and while I appreciate the advocates who support wolves, we also support all wildlife, not just a species-specific animal. We do have some legitimate concerns about the lack of activity and the lack of numbers in Mexico. While Mexico's historic range is suitable habitat and has been proven to be so over the years, 90% of that area is where it needs to be concentrated for the future. I agree with the philosophy of having animals that have been proven to be productive and skilled at being wolves being recaptured and then relocated into Mexico. I think that's the best way for them to start to grow their own packs down there, and for genetic diversity purposes, I think it's wonderful. In terms of the rest of the impact that we're seeing, certainly the bee line has been our line of demarcation in the past. We would encourage that any translocations that do occur, make sure that these wolves are collared so we know exactly where they're going and what kind of impact they're having on a local basis. Certainly we know that there are citizens who are concerned, and we would like to know, particularly for those animals that stray further and closer into civilization, for pets, for kids, for anything else. We have seen that habituated animals do take on different attitudes, and we encourage everybody to study those. That's why we're asking that the collared animals be studied very closely. Thank you.
Mr. DeVos, I do have, I think, one follow-up question, kind of probably half a statement and then just a follow-up question is, I mean, I want to reiterate for the public that this department and this commission has been fully engaged in the wolf reintroduction program since 1982, if I'm correct on my dates. And that relationship has been a science-based relationship of trying to successfully reintroduce a wolf population in our state, managed with our federal partners for a successful outcome for all wildlife across Arizona. And the impact of one species on another has always been the basis of that management. And my understanding, and I just want to make sure the record is clear, we've seen growth in our wolf population of what percentage over the last several years. And I know we're going to have new data in January, which I'm willing to bet the House is going to exceed what anyone would consider to be a successful number. But what has it been the last few years, Mr. DeVos?
Mr. Chairman, the last 3 years have been great years for Mexican wolf recovery. 3 years ago, we've exceeded an average of 10% for each of the last 3 years. And the population is, from memory, about 60% higher today than it was 3 years ago.
And you would anticipate when figures finalized for the end of this year will probably reach those levels.
Mr. Chairman, based on field observations to date, we had a number of packs that successfully produced pups. Now, to be consistent with our year-end count, it's unfair to say how many from today will make it till December 31st, but certainly based on preliminary field data, it looks like a banner year for Mexican wolf production.
I would entertain a motion related to the recommendation of the department.
Mr. JW, I move the recommendation.
Second by Bob.
We have a motion by Commissioner Harris, and we have a second by Chairman Mansell. Okay. Is there any further discussion by anybody? Any members want to say anything? There is something I would like to put into the record, if you can indulge me for a minute, Mr. DeVos, just to make the record clear on this. And first of all, I want to commend the department for its ongoing and continuing discussions. Being on the commission, you're fully aware of how many hours our professional staff, our scientists, put into this endeavor, and from my opinion, success. But I want to commend the department for continuing to keep the doors of communication open. The commission has been very direct about wanting to continue discussions, negotiation, but also providing and protecting its options if partners choose to not be in a cooperative stance. But with that, I'd like to take a moment to explain my position on this issue and that the department presented to the commission. First, Mexican wolf management has been controversial since the beginning of the program and will continue to be so in the future. A number of cooperating agencies and stakeholders developed a lawful and biologically relevant alternative for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to include in the draft environmental statement, and asked the service to evaluate this alternative as a method to improve social tolerance and conservation success of Mexican wolf reintroduction in the Southwest. This compromise position was hard-won, with all entities involved yielding some principles of values to them, but in the end there was a compromise and unprecedented support of those cooperating entities for a well-thought-out Mexican wolf reintroduction approach. The service failed to recognize the importance of this unprecedented compromise and excluded the alternative from the analysis. This was and is unfortunate. The Arizona Game and Fish Commission has long been supportive of a balanced plan to reintroduce the Mexican wolf into historic habitat. Seeing the failing of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to pay heed to the wishes of the cooperating agencies and stakeholders, the Commission provided direction to the Department to continue to negotiate with the service to modify the final rule to include key elements of the cooperating agency's alternative. The Commission also voted unanimously to direct the Department to prepare strategies to implement congressional involvement, possible litigation, and even withdrawal from the Mexican wolf field program. One of the key issues that the Commission had with the Service's proposed rule is that there was no cap on the number of wolves that would roam the state and impact both ungulates and livestock operations. Relying on a poorly documented projection of 10% annual increase in wolf population, the Service projected less than 300 wolves on the landscape in 12 years. It is important to note that the last 3 years have been averaged greater population growth rates than this. And based on this year's preliminary production data, the population will again exceed 10% growth, and perhaps greatly so. Simply put, without a clearly articulated number, the impact to Arizona wildlife and livestock resources would be too large for the Commission to accept. The reintroduction of the Mexican wolf is mandated by the Endangered Species Act, and the discussion of having no wolves or even 100 wolves is a failed argument at this time in our history. The Department and Commission have sought a balanced approach to Mexican wolf reintroduction rather than the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service alternative that has the potential for unregulated wolf population growth that would clearly have greater impact to the people and its wildlife in Arizona. The Commission's action today is to have a managed, scientific approach to Mexican wolf reintroduction rather than the clear uncertainty provided by the Service's preferred alternative. In addition, the alternative that is being proposed by this department and suggested to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is based on being able to set markers that we will know when we achieve success. We will know what the impact is on all of our state's wildlife. I want to commend the department again for working with the cooperators and coming up with a plan based in science to achieve a counterproposal that is rational, realistic, and reasonable to actually achieve success and balance among all God's creatures in Arizona. And with that, I will be supporting the motion so we can continue the dialogue and hopefully achieve a rule that works for both advocates of wolves and those who also view wolves as part of numerous and many species that wander our habitat. So with that, if you mind, I would like to call a vote unless you have Mr. Comment, Mr. Madden.
I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Deputy Director DeVos and the staff for their relentless work on these negotiations, and I fully support the proposal before us.
With that, fellow commissioners, all those in favor of the department recommendation vote aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any of those nay? Recommendation passes unanimously.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. DeVos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do you have any other orders of business, Mr. Paxson?
Vice Chair Davis, that's the only agenda item. We have no further business today.
Thank you to our public for coming, and with that, the meeting is adjourned.